One of the most striking social phenomena of the recent past was the byproduct of a leading national magazine. Have you ever fantasized becoming a playboy or a playgirl, luxuriating in resort hotels in the company of this month's centerfold sex symbol? Why not the playboy life, the hedonic life in which pleasure is pursued as the highest good, the life of pleasurable indulgences in food and drink and sex and drugs and sleep and all the titillations of the body that we can experience? Plato answers this question over and over again in subtly different ways. His point is always that pleasure is not the highest good for humans, because, says Plato, the highest good for anything, human or non-human, consists in fulfilling its own nature, in living up to its own nature, its own form or essence. And my nature as a human being does not consist only in my bodily appetites, but it consists also in the other two parts of the tripartite form of the self. My spirited element of aggressive, ambitious, courageous, self-assertive, and patriotic emotions and traits, and also in my rational element, my powers of speech and reason. My highest good, my moral good, requires that I fulfill all three parts of myself in accordance with their proper harmony or order. Their proper order is a hierarchy, with reason as the highest, most worthy element, the bodily elements the lowest, and the spirited traits intermediate between them. The just man, says Plato, does not allow the several elements in his soul to usurp one another's functions. Rather, Plato continues in a famous line, the just man sets his house in order, so that the bodily appetites do not take over the ruling position that reason should have. The good life, according to Plato, is the balanced life, and it delivers human happiness and a sense of well-being of the whole person. The body must be satisfied and be healthy, strong, and beautiful. Ambition, aggression, self-assertion, loyalty, the sense of honor, these spirited energies must drive the self to activity and achievement, but must be directed and controlled by reason. And finally, the good life, as Plato describes it, is sometimes called the life of reason. But Plato does not mean that the good life is that of the narrowly over-intellectualized person lacking in spirit and without a strong, healthy body. The good life is not the life of reason alone, but only of the dominance of reason. And thus to the question, why not live the life of pleasure? Plato answers with his own formulation of the Greek ideal of the development of human beings who are excellent in mind, body, and character. Western civilization has been in love for more than 2,000 years with the Greek ideal of the good life, and with Plato's version of the good life as the life of balanced fulfillment of our complex human nature, the life of reason, appetites, and spirit, the life of healthy, honorable, intelligent happiness under the sun, which is the symbol of the idea of the good, the perfect principle of truth and beauty and goodness. This, then, is Plato's moral philosophy, or his ethics. Moral philosophy or ethics may be defined as the branch of philosophy which studies the nature of good and evil, right and wrong, duty and obligation. Moral philosophy or ethics ask questions such as, is there a highest good, an absolute good for human beings? Or, as the sophists argued, are all goods relative to time and place, to history and to culture? Is the good knowable? Is the good rational, or is it merely the voice of the spirited and bodily passions? Is the highest moral good the achieving of happiness, or is it the performing of one's duty? We have seen that Plato does indeed affirm a highest good for man, and that it is absolute, eternal, and immutable, and it is knowable and rational. For Plato's ethics, for Plato's moral philosophy, What then is the highest good? For Plato, the highest good for human beings is the happiness or well-being which comes from the fulfillment of the three parts of the soul under the rule of reason. And for Plato's ethics, what then is virtue? Virtue, or the right conduct of life, is action which flows from knowledge of the tripartite soul, from knowledge of all the forms, and the idea of the good. Only the few have such knowledge, and they therefore should rightfully control the conduct of all the other members of society. And so the heart of Plato's view of virtue is still Socrates' original statement that virtue is knowledge. Plato tells us that if we want to see personal morality more clearly, we must turn to the state, where Plato says it is writ large for us to see. Problems of the state form the topic to which the Republic is principally dedicated, the problems of political philosophy. Political philosophy may be defined as the branch of philosophy which studies such problems as what is the good society, what is justice, in whom ought control to be vested, what is the relation of subordination, superordination between the state and the individual. Does the state exist to serve the individual, or does the individual exist to serve the state? Plato's political philosophy answers these questions by building upon his ethics, his moral philosophy. Now, his moral philosophy has already established the form of justice in the human soul. The human individual is just or virtuous insofar as he or she lives in accordance with the harmonious structure of the three parts of the soul. But what does justice in an individual person have to do with the state? What is justice in the state, which is the political organization of the city? A city, says Plato, is a man writ large against the sky. The elements that make up a city, he says, correspond to the elements of the individual human soul. And the justice or morality of the city is the same as it is for the individual. What then are the elements of the state that correspond to the elements of the tripartite soul? Like the individual human soul, with its three parts, every state of whatever type necessarily has three parts, he says, which are its three social classes: a producer class, a military or warrior class, and a governing or ruling class. And in the ideal city, the Republic, which Socrates and his young disciples are designing, each of these three classes will perform a vital function on behalf of the organic totality, which is the society. The producer class will provide themselves and the other two classes with the necessities of life: food, shelter, clothing, trade, and commerce. The producer class is made up of farmers, herdsmen, blacksmiths, fishermen, carpenters, shipbuilders, shoemakers, weavers, laborers, merchants, retailers, and bankers. The producer class corresponds to the appetitive element, the element of appetites in the soul of the individual human being. As on the diagram you can see that the warrior, or the warrior class, which Plato also calls the auxiliaries, since they aid or supplement the work of the guardians, they correspond to the spirited element. And the rulers, sometimes called the guardians, correspond to the element of reason in the soul. The members of the producer class will be drawn from that type of person in whom the bodily appetites are dominant, and who live for money and what money can buy. The members of the ruling class will be drawn from that type of person in whom reason is dominant and who live only for truth. The warrior class will be drawn from that type of person in whom the spirited element is dominant and who lives for honor or for success in aggressive and courageous acts. Thus, each class in the state is parallel to a part of the soul and its function. The ruling class, dominated by reason, is at the top of the social order and directs and controls the two other classes. Strictly parallel to the justice of the soul is the justice of the state, in which each class performs its appropriate function harmoniously under the rule of the most rational. But why should the state be ruled by an elite group of the most rational? We who live in a democracy which traces its own roots back to Athenian democracy cannot help raising this question. Plato answers this question most forcefully in the dialogue called the Protagoras. When you are in ill health, says Plato, you go to the most competent medical specialist, to the best expertise you can find. You don't ask everyone you meet on the street for advice. You don't take a vote among as many people as possible as to what your illness is or what to do about it. Why then, with regard to problems of the health of the state, problems of the body politic, problems of the utmost political importance, should we consult the advice, he says, of the ignorant many? Plato's point is that governing a society is a skill that requires specialized and intensive training, far greater than that required for the training of a shipbuilder, a shoemaker, or a physician. What then is the training that is necessary for those who would be capable of piloting effectively and wisely the ship of state? Plato's answer to this is his theory of the selection and education of the guardian or ruler class. How, first of all, are the members of the guardian class to be selected? Membership in the ruling class is by natural capacity of intelligence, by IQ, as we would say. Plato believed that heredity is the prime factor in intelligence, and that for the most part, the children of the most intelligent will also be of highest intelligence, and the children of those who have the natural capacity only to be shoemakers will, like their parents, have the natural capacity only to be shoemakers. But Plato was well aware of exceptions. Plato was very sensitive to problems of genetics, and therefore Plato decided that the ranks of the guardian class, the elite class of the intelligent, must be open to the children of all classes, and that throughout the Republic, in the early years of child development, all children in all classes must be kept under constant observation and testing in order to identify those children who are of sufficiently high intelligence to be trained for the guardian class. The selection of the guardians, then, is from all classes by natural intellectual capacity. And women as well as men, according to Plato, possess the natural capacity of intelligence to become members of the ruling class. Plato stands out in the history of Western philosophy as the first supporter, along with Socrates, of the intellectual equality of the sexes. Book 5 of the Republic has been hailed by the contemporary women's movement for its defense of the equality of the sexes. There is only one difference between men and women, Plato argues, and that is that males beget and women bear children. But this difference has no more to do with the capacity for functioning in the world or in the life of the city than the difference between being bald-headed or having hair. Women, like men, have the natural capacities which will fit some women for the ruler class, some women to be warriors and auxiliaries, some to be producers. Women in the Republic will therefore share in the life of all three classes. What a supporter of ERA Plato would have made. How then shall the philosopher-kings be trained? Their training is by education and by the experience of service to the state. Education for those selected to be guardians begins as children with strictly censored music and literature for the mind and gymnastics for the strength and health of the body. In time they will then ascend on the divided line of knowledge to be trained in mathematics, astronomy, and other sciences whose objects are in the intelligible world. And by the age of 30, those who have successfully come through a series of competitive examinations and proven themselves to have the intelligence, the strength and balance of character, and the bodily vigor and stamina will have completed their education on the third level of the divided line. And now, for the last time, the group of candidates will again be weeded out, the ones remaining being eligible to advance now to the study of dialectic, on the fourth and the highest level of knowledge, in which, by reason alone, the candidate for the guardian class will study and come to know the eternal truths which are the forms, each form in itself and all in their interrelationships and totality. Finally, Plato says, the guardian attains at last to the absolute good by intellectual vision, and therein reaches the limit of the intellectual world. 5 years will be devoted to training in dialectic. At this point, when the candidates in training are now 35 years old, they will be sent down into the cave, says Plato, and compelled to hold any military or other post for which the young are qualified. The purpose of the return to the cave of political life from their years of study under the sun is to give them the experience of everyday politics and to see how well they handle various kinds of temptations. They will be required to spend 15 years in this probationary period. At the age of 50, those who have met this last test of intelligence and character will be admitted to the governing class. They will have become philosopher-kings, with the responsibility of governing all the individuals in all classes, as well as their own lives, by the absolute truth and absolute good which they have learned through their long education in knowledge and virtue. What will their lives be like? Strenuously disciplined, sternly self-denying, yet totally inspired and dedicated to the task. Is there any training for rulership in our contemporary world like this, other than that within the Roman Catholic Church? Both the guardian class and the military class are forbidden by Plato to possess any private property or any money. They must live, men and women, like soldiers in barracks, with common meals and sleeping quarters. Their modest clothing and equipment will be provided by the producers. Their food must be restricted to moderate quantities. They are to have no family life in order to avoid any conflict between family loyalties and their loyalty to the state. The guardian's sexual gratification is also restricted while in the prime of life to officially designated and infrequent occasions on which the guardians are required to mate in order to breed children to maintain the numbers of the guardian class. These are the occasions for what Plato calls sacred marriages, which are in fact temporary sexual unions for the sake of producing children for the guardian class. These marriages are far too important to permit them to be made on the basis of personal preference. Plato's plans for the breeding of the rulers of the Republic are utopian beyond anything foreseeable in our present society. Only our science fiction compares in boldness with Plato. Plato was thinking of breeding humans as scientifically and with as much care as his brother Glaucon breeds dogs, or as we breed racehorses or prize cattle. Would you be in favor of using our growing scientific knowledge at the present time of genetics to produce humans of superior mental and physical capacity? The very mention of such a proposal is terrifying to many people today. Plato had no such fears. Plato knew that the form of the human being required a standard of excellence in mind and character and body, and these were the very qualities he required for the guardian class. And so he has Socrates ask Glaucon in section 459 of the Republic. I see, Glaucon, you keep sporting dogs at your house. Do you breed from all indiscriminately? Are you not careful to breed from the best as far as you can, and from those in their prime? No less care than that will be devoted to breeding the guardians of the Republic. Who will mate with whom will be determined by the older guardians, and the best male guardians will be mated with the best female guardians. But the guardians will not know that their mates have been selected for them. To avoid their complaints, they will be told that the mating is by lottery. This is a lie, but it is what Plato calls a noble lie, a lie which is rationally justified for the good of the state. The children who will be born from these matings will be raised with exquisite care in a communal nursery. Mentally defective or physically deformed or defective infants born from these matings will be put away immediately to die in some unknown place. Is your moral sensibility revolted by this aspect of ancient Greek attitudes toward human life? Or do you agree with Plato and with many people today that in these cases infanticide is moral and can be made humane? By contrast with the severe discipline under which the guardian class lives, how easy the life of the producer class appears. Except for governmental regulations imposed by the rulers, the lives of the producers follow the old familiar patterns of home and property, family and children, work, rest, recreation, and the daily news. By nature, the producers love money and what money can buy. The many, says Plato in a famous phrase, love getting and spending. As anyone can plainly see who goes shopping on Saturdays, when after a week of working and getting, the producer class in the United States does its spending, packing the stores downtown and swarming over the suburban shopping centers. Plato planned governmental regulation of the accumulation of wealth in order to maintain economic moderation in the Republic. Plato was afraid that otherwise the cleverer producers will get richer and the rest poorer, and conflict would inevitably break out. But the Republic makes, in fact, the fewest demands for change upon the producer class. They alone, of all the three classes, can keep gold and silver, live in their nuclear family units, work for the most part at their traditional occupations, and they are free in their sexual activities. Each member of the producer class will be taught a trade or profession, farming, banking, carpentry, according to his or her own capabilities, and according to the needs of the society, both of which will be determined by the guardians. Since the producer class cannot grasp abstract concepts, education with respect to the forms would be wasted on them. But they must be given another type of education as well as learning their trade. They will be taught to learn to be virtuous producers. A state propaganda agency will indoctrinate the producers with respect and obedience for the guardians, with loyalty and patriotism to the Republic, and with strong work motivation. Music, stories of heroism, fables, and the graphic arts will all be used for purposes of indoctrination. And governmental censorship will also be required to monitor and censor legends, stories about the gods, poems, and plays. The guardians, after all, have the responsibility of protecting all the members of society from the insidious, demoralizing attractions of some of the artists, poets, dramatists, and musicians. Plato is morally opposed to the poet Homer portraying the gods as quarreling, telling lies, and seeking revenge. Plato also plans to censor slack and unmanly music. What would Plato have done with rock and roll, Elvis Presley style? In Book 3 of the Republic, Plato says that a young man should not be allowed to see a play in which violence seems to be commonplace. Plato would surely see the frequency of television violence as having this same effect. The nightly showing of violence sends a message to the audience that there is nothing surprising about violent assault or rape or homicide. In fact, it is quite commonplace, and so, in a sense, is acceptable. Would you agree? In the current debate over the influence of television violence on children, Plato would argue for censoring all violence, for adult viewing as well as for children, and for two reasons. One, that the frequency of television makes it a commonplace, television violence makes it a commonplace and therefore somewhat acceptable. And two, the frequency of television violence is a stimulus to some to perform the same violent acts in their own lives. Critics of Plato's Republic have accused it of being anti-democratic, which of course it is. Others have accused it of being communist. Still others have called it fascist. Is Plato a totalitarian in his politics? Totalitarianism is a type of 20th century politics which cannot meaningfully be used to describe the politics of the ancient Greek city-state in the 5th century before Christ. But in his political philosophy, Plato is a political absolutist, advocating the subordination of the individual to the state and vesting absolute and unchecked power in an elite group. But there are certain resemblances between Plato's political absolutism and totalitarianism of the 20th century. Like totalitarian governments, right-wing and left-wing, fascist and communist, Plato rejected individualism and democracy and argued for the subordination of the individual to the supremacy and power of the state. Like totalitarian governments, Plato denied individual rights, civil liberties, due process of the law, and he advocated government by an elite group with unchecked power, with state censorship, thought control by propaganda, state control of the economy, the intrusion of the state into almost all areas of the private life. But Plato would have detested modern totalitarianism, just as he detested Thrasymachus's philosophy that might makes right. For Plato, there is only one justification for his regimented absolutistic state, that it is founded on true knowledge, on the eternally true essence of justice. Any other justification for government, Plato would condemn as illegitimate. Government justified by power, race, wealth, aristocratic birth, the glorification of a social class, as in communism, or the glorification of a particular leader, as in fascism. Since Plato viewed his ideal republic as having absolutely true knowledge of the essence of justice, of a good society, and of a good human being, he believed that his republic is entitled to absolute power and complete responsibility for making its citizens virtuous and for controlling the entire society. Aha, I hear you say. Isn't that what all absolutist governments and churches have always said? Our knowledge of the truth justifies our absolute control over everyone. There are two challenges which must be made to Plato's republic and to any other absolutist politics. First, are there, as Plato claims, absolutely true and unchanging forms of justice, human nature, society, and the good? Do you think that Plato has proved this? Second, who guards the guardians? What is the guarantee that the rulers will not be corrupted by such absolute power? What provisions are made in the Republic for checking on the policies and activities of the guardians and for removing them from office if necessary? All the Western democracies have such safeguards against the abuse of power, but no absolutist church or state has such safeguards, and no totalitarian government has. Plato, as an absolutist, has failed us here. Despite these and other problems, the Republic of Plato stands forth for all time as the source of the rationalist tradition, the tradition of reason in Western civilization. Plato's Republic presents a philosophic vision of a realm of eternal truth and beauty and goodness above the flux of changing opinion. It is Plato's vision that through the human love of truth and through the power of human reason, we may yet come to know the true essences of all things and the idea of good itself, and with this knowledge, design and build an ideal society. This is the ancient and continuing promise of Plato's Republic.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.